For over 800 years, tennis has had a serious money problem. You see, from the 12th century to the 20th century, the sport has been overruled by the rich and affluent. But for the past few decades, tennis has seen an influx in players from hundreds of different backgrounds, and the majority of these guys aren't the Federer, Nadal or Djokovic type. Instead, they're more like Caruso, someone who has been a professional for more than 12 years, yet ranked 258 out of 106 million worldwide. And in 2025, he only took home $38,258. Now let's compare that to someone playing for a football club which is one league below the Premier League. Omari Kellyman has made £1.7 million this year, and that's combined with a secure contract. But if we look back to Caruso, if he loses or gets an injury, there's no guaranteed paycheck or safety net of a contract. Instead, anyone in the same position as Caruso has to battle every single week for their chance at developing their own career. So in this first video of a 3-part series, we're going to be zooming in on how money influences players, Grand Slams, and major brands. With that being said, I want to show you this fact. Less than 0.01% of all tennis players become ranked professionals, and of those who are ranked, only about 1 in 5 ever make enough from tennis to cover their basic professional costs. In other words, for every 10,000 kids who pick up a racket, maybe 1 ever reaches a decent professional level. And if we were to look at the stats comparing the number of people that go pro in other sports to how much they earn, we'd notice a huge difference, because for the 10 to 15 years of mental, physical, and economic hardships most tennis pros go through, sports like basketball and football create teams around players, and clubs help these individuals a lot. So I'm not saying other sports are easier, but I'm saying that tennis is built for aspiring pros to fail. Nick Kyrgios even said that tennis is brutal. It's tough because you play for 4 or 5 hours, then you have 1 day off, and then you have to do it all again. And that's 7 times in a row for a Grand Slam, so it's almost impossible. Because if we think about it, why would the ATP not want more pros competing? Since it would just increase the likelihood of seeing another Alcaraz or Djokovic despite the low chances. And this would then just bring in millions of more fans and increase the overall revenue the ATP receives, which in my personal opinion is a really good thing. But here is where the entire system shows its flaws, because there's no minimum salary for tennis. You could be ranked inside the top 300 like Caruso, train full time, travel week after week, beat other professionals, and still earn close to nothing. And to me, that feels really wrong, especially when you place it next to other sports, where just making it into the league comes with a contract, a base income, and protection if anything goes wrong. But in tennis, being good enough or close to good enough doesn't mean you're paid enough. It just means you're allowed to keep trying. And so while the effort of other players are rising to keep up with the competition, the very top of the sport silently filters these players out. Not because they lack talent, they have plenty of that, but it's just because they run out of money. So where does the money in tennis actually come from? Well, it's mostly in 2 places, Grand Slams and sponsors, but even then, it only really works if you go deep or become really famous. At the Slams, the winners can earn around $3 to $3.5 million, which does sound huge, but there's a really quick drop off. So you don't lose because you're bad, but sometimes you lose because the margins of error are so tiny, only a few can survive long enough to benefit. And sponsors make this gap even wider. If you're one of the faces of the sport, money comes in really well even when you don't play. And Roger Federer is the clearest example of this, because over his career, he earned about $130 million from prize money, which is already more than almost anyone. But that's really small compared to his sponsorship income, because just in 2018 alone, Uniqlo signed him to a $300 million deal over 10 years. By the end, Federer made close to $1 billion from tennis, and it was mostly off the court. But that's the really extreme top. If we look lower down and take someone like Lopez, he was a top 10 player, he won many titles, he even played at Wimbledon for nearly 2 decades and had a career most players would dream of. His total prize money sits around $18 million, which is a lot, but it's significantly less than what Federer earned from Uniqlo alone. And Lopez still had to pay all the same costs year after year. It was the same sport, the same slams, but it was a completely different outcome for him. So Grand Slams and sponsors can make players really rich, but only if everything lines up, like the results, the timing, the personality, and the marketability. Because if a brand can't put your name out to huge audiences, then why is it even going to choose you? And for most pros, slams just help them survive another season, and sponsors barely cover expenses. So let's look at it like this. Tennis doesn't really reward effort evenly, it rewards a tiny group at the top, and everyone else is left chasing the next draw. And they're all hoping that this time it lasts long enough for them to matter. However, tennis is one of the only sports to be played all year round, which does have some major drawbacks, but it does give players something very few other sports can give: global influence, because brands from multiple countries would be aware of who you are and what you offer, since every match is being broadcasted live to huge audiences. And this year-round calendar is where tennis quietly gives its players an edge, because they're not locked into one league window or just one market, but instead they stay visible to a whole global audience for the whole year. As the tour moves from the Australian Open into the United States, across Europe, and then later into Asia, and then to the Middle East, players who keep winning matches remain on broadcast courts month after month. And a good run in Indian Wells doesn't go away when the event ends, because the next week brings Miami, then the European swing, and then the grass season in Wimbledon. And suddenly a player has spent half the year in front of international audiences without ever needing a reset. This kind of exposure is exactly what sponsors value. Brands are not attaching themselves to one moment, but they're attaching themselves to presence, and that's exactly what this sport and these players can bring. So when a player appears regularly on main courts wearing the same gear, keeping their name circulating across different regions, brand relationships grow naturally over time. And this is where players like Medvedev or Tsitsipas has built strong off-court earnings even without dominating the sport like Djokovic or Nadal, because their consistency keeps them visible in multiple markets across the entire season. The calendar also gives players room to change their commercial story, and a slow start doesn't close doors, but just one strong run later in the year can shift how a player is seen almost instantly. Top 50, this constant cycle always allows off-court income to grow alongside results, rather than depending on a single payday. When a player stays relevant across surfaces and different continents, sponsors sees longevity, and this is exactly what Uniqlo and Nike saw in Federer. So while the travel demands are real, the structure of tennis offers something very few sports can match. When people hear a tennis player earned $100,000 in a week, they assume the money changes everything. But that number lies, not because it's fake, but because it ignores what happens the moment the match ends. Because in tennis, earnings look big at the surface, but once you follow the money, it shrinks really quickly. If we take tax for example, tennis players don't earn in one country, they earn wherever the tour sends them. So if you win a match in France, France takes its share. Win in the US, and the US takes its share. And since tax differs from each country, you could be earning up to 50% less than what you won. Carlos Alcaraz found this out really early. After winning the French Open, reports suggested close to half of his prize money never reached him because of the French taxes alone. And Alcaraz is even protected. He has sponsors, lawyers, and so many financial advisors, but a player ranked 150th doesn't. They face similar rates, but without any cushion. So a big win often arrives already cut in half. Now let's zoom out to a full season of tennis, because it doesn't have a singular place where you can play matches and win money, and it doesn't have a guaranteed schedule. One week you could be flying out to Brazil, and the next to Barcelona, then Miami, then Rome. And flights aren't optional. If you miss a tournament, your ranking drops. If your ranking drops, then your income disappears completely. Accommodation and hotels make it even worse, because while some of the top tournaments help, most don't. Especially at lower levels, where players book rooms hoping they'll stay long enough to justify the cost of even going out to that country. Then there's one of the most important aspects of each tennis player, their coach. Every player needs one, but coaches don't just stand courtside. You pay their salary, their flights, their hotels, and their food. Even a basic setup can cost over $70,000 a year. And when you add on a physio if you ever get any injuries, which tennis players most likely often do, costs rise again. But if you travel alone to save money, your level drops because you don't even have an ex-pro player to help you on your mistakes. And so your results dip, and suddenly your saving costs you your career. So when a player ranked around 200 earns $150,000 in a season, it sounds stable, but after the tax, the travel, the hotels, staff, and gear, many of these players barely break even. And that's the reality people don't see. because tennis doesn't just reward talent, it rewards how long you can survive financially without running out of any money. The constant global exposure sounds like a clear advantage, but it only really works once a player has crossed a very specific line in the rankings. And this is where the structure of the tour begins to work against a huge group of professionals. Around the top 150, tennis hits a sharp drop-off, because inside that range, players gain regular access to main draws at Grand Slams and Masters events, where even an early loss can bring in tens of thousands of dollars, and just as importantly, another week of visibility on major courts. But going outside of it, the calendar looks very different, because players ranked around 150 to 400 spend most of their season on the challenger or future circuits, and this is where prize money falls fast while expectations still stay the same. Because your costs are going to stay the same regardless of your ranking, flights, hotels, or your coaches, and a typical challenger week can still cost more than $2,000. Yet a first round loss might only pay around a few $100s. And even winning multiple matches doesn't guarantee much profit, and over a full season, a player can perform really well, improve their level, but still finish with little to show financially. And so this creates a really large dead zone. While players are too strong to dominate lower levels easily, they're not secure enough to benefit from the sport's biggest stages. So progress becomes less about development and more about survival, which is why so many players in this range depend on family support, national federations, or private funding just to keep their season alive. I appreciate you guys so much for watching this video. It would mean so much if you liked, subscribed, and joined my private tennis community in the pinned comment down below.